Welcome to the video where I respond to 24 questions about tropical Vedic astrology. Before we jump into those questions and answers, I want to take a minute or two to make sure that we're all on the same page about what the tropical zodiac is, what a sidereal zodiac is, and what the differences are. Because once we're on the same page about that, you'll be able to digest the information I present in all these questions and answers a lot more easily and a lot more thoroughly, completely. So, tropical and sidereal zodiacs agree on many, many things. Let's go over what they do agree on. Both zodiacs agree that there are 12 signs of 30 degrees each, and that little graphic there shows you why. Because it's the sun moving around the earth, covering 30 degrees of space every time the moon moves around once. So both zodiacs agree that there are 12 signs, each one is 30 degrees. We agree on what the signs' names are, etc., the order they're in. We all agree that these signs are composed of elements, which are sometimes called quadruplicities, like earth, water, fire, and air. And modes, which are sometimes called triplicities, or cardinal, fixed, and dual. And we also agree that each sign has a planetary ruler. So basically, we are both describing exactly the same zodiac. There's really nothing different about the zodiac except for one thing. The only thing where we disagree is where the 12 divisions start. So there's two opinions. One is the opinion that these 12 divisions start from a star. And that opinion is called the sidereal opinion because sidereus means star. So sidereal means star-based zodiac. And it's called a star-based zodiac because the 0 point of Aries, the part where the zodiac starts, is fixed to a star. And on the other hand, the other point of view is the tropical point of view, and it's that the zodiac isn't fixed to a star, but it's fixed to where the sun's path crosses the equator. That's called the equinox. And so the tropical theory is that the zodiac is all about equinoxes and solstices. Solstice is where the sun is the most north or south of the equator, and equinox is where it's exactly on the equator. And the tropical theory says that the zodiac 0 Aries starts right where the sun comes over the equator, right when it's on top of the equator going north. So that is the only difference, where the zodiac starts. Sidereal says it's fixed to a star. Tropical says it's fixed to the equinox. Now that that's out of the way, and now that we are on the same page about what the difference is between tropical and sidereal, let's jump into these 24 questions and answers.
There's plenty of historical research showing astrologers from classical times using sidereal charts.
Because in those days, the calculations were uncertain, and we had to fact check our calculations visually. So the problem is, to do visual fact checking, you need something you can see. But you cannot see signs. So how are you going to fact check the calculation of signs? You can relate the invisible thing to a visible thing. So this is why you find in old surviving horoscopes mentions about the stars in relationship to the zodiac signs. Somebody might want to argue that no, that's not like that. The reason why they're mentioning the stars in old horoscopes is because the zodiac signs used to be based on the stars. Simple as that. You can say that, but then you have to ignore all of the surviving definitions that we have in the Purāṇas and Siddhāntas that define the zodiac as based on the solstices. So that's not a good explanation when we have their own words saying that the zodiac are anchored to the solstices and equinoxes. Now, as for the history outside of India, I am not a specialist in non-Indian astrological history, but my suggestion is exactly the same answer. For example, a surviving text from Babylonian astronomy is Mulapin. Now, Mulapin follows the exact same pattern as the Purāṇas and the Siddhāntas. It says that the equinox marks Libra, and it gives visual reference stars for that. And if you want to know the exact reference in Mula Pin or anything that I'm saying, look in the description text below this video on YouTube. Now, I also just want to mention one more thing at this point. There's one more thing that can really confuse people when you look back in history and try to figure out if they were doing things sidereal or tropically. And that's the fact that all of the classical cultures, whether they were in India or anywhere, they definitely did have sidereal versions of the sky and used those sidereal versions primarily in the ancient times. But those divisions are not the 12 zodiac divisions. They're variously numbered in various cultures. Like, for example, in India, there are 27 of them. 27 divisions based on stars are different than the 12 divisions based on equinoxes.
Okay, there's a classical text, Hora Ratnam, that says, some people say tropical calculations should be used, but the prevailing popular custom is to use sidereal calculations. Hora Ratnam then quotes an even older text, Vasishtha Samhita, which prescribes against tropical calculations, and this shows that the sidereal zodiac has been dominant in Indian culture since olden times.
Vasishtha Samhita doesn't prescribe against tropical signs. It prescribes against using tropical nakshatras. So I agree with it completely. And in any case, even if it does prescribe against using tropical signs, it was written in the 13th century. And the other book that you mentioned, Hora Ratna, was written in the 17th century. So I've never claimed, and I don't think anybody that I know has ever claimed, that in that time frame, 13th century through 17th century, that the tropical zodiac was accepted in India. Everybody agrees that in that time frame, the sidereal zodiac, 12-fold zodiac, was widely dominant in India. We've got the Purāṇas and the Siddhāntas, which are like 4th century, 5th century or earlier, and they definitely give a tropical definition of the zodiac. My view is that in the original times, about 2,000 years ago, the conception of the zodiac was tropical. Then we have statements from Varaha Mihira in the 6th century. He's writing in his books that he's a little bit unsure why nobody is updating the position of the actual solstices and equinoxes anymore. They're all just going by the calculations that their fathers used or their teachers used. They're just going by custom. So what you see in the 6th century is a surviving statement of somebody who's observing the shift to sidereal. So it looks like 4th century, 5th century, and earlier, tropical was dominant in India. 5th, 6th century, the shift happened. By the 8th century on to modern times, sidereal has been dominant in India. That's my story. So if you have references from the 13th century and 17th century showing that sidereal was dominant in India, that perfectly fits with my story.
Why would India adopt the sidereal conception when the rest of the world went with the tropical conception?
Well, I suggest that India went a different direction than the rest of the world, primarily because of how dominant the sidereal things were in their pre-existing practice of astrology. And couple that with how the culture itself is designed to preserve the way things have already been done. So since the culture itself is designed to preserve how things have already been done, and since the way things have already been done is always in reference to stars, it's easy to see how India would have went in favor of a sidereal definition of where the zodiac begins.
Okay, Sūrya Siddhānta 127 states that the end of Revati is the end of a cycle, and the next text, 128, states that this cycle is divided into 12 segments called Rashi. This shows that the Sūrya Siddhānta conceived of the 12 zodiac signs anchored to the Revati Aśvinī border.
Now, this argument is just completely out of context, so let's take a look at the context. These quotes are coming from the first chapter of Sūrya Siddhānta. First chapter of Sūrya Siddhānta has 9 texts that just introduce the book, and then the meat of the book starts with the 10th. 10th through 24th texts, they're talking about how to measure time. And they begin with minuscule measurements of time, and they expand up, and up to these cosmological, huge epochs of time. And the whole intent of the first chapter is to place the reader on a timeline of cosmic history and to show where our current place is in the huge cosmic span of history. So that's 10 and 24 setting that up. And then text 25 through 34, which is the section that these quotes come from, is the explanation of how you figure out where you are in the cosmic timescale. So in that section, text 25 gives a summary of how you do it. The summary is that there's a kind of ayanamsha at play, because they identify that the stars drift in relationship to the way the sun and the planets move. And so if you can observe conjunctions of planets occurring in conjunction with specific fixed stars, yogatars, then you can tell what period of universal history you're in. Okay, so text 25 gives that kind of summary. Text 27 specifically says it's Zeta Pisceum, which is the Revati nakshatra yogatara. The conjunction of planets in connection with Revati yogatara is for the current epoch. And then 28, which follows that statement, tells you how to measure arcs to tell how close the planets are to that reference star. And that statement 28 is the one that says, okay, you got a complete circuit of 360 degrees, and you got 12 rashis of 30 degrees, and then you have the degrees themselves, and they're divided into minutes and seconds. So the argument that you're presenting is that Sūrya Siddhānta chapter 1 establishes Revati yogatara as the defining beginning of the zodiac. But in fact, chapter 1 of Sūrya Siddhānta establishes Revati yogatara as the reference point for measuring the current yuga, the current cosmological age.
Okay, but chapter 3 of Sūrya Siddhānta describes that inherently tropical calculations, such as the ascendant, must be converted to sidereal by deducting the ayanamsha. And this shows that the final chart being produced from these calculations uses ayanamsha. In other words, the Sūrya Siddhānta calculations produce sidereal charts.
So again, here we're in chapter 3. We're not really talking about astrological birth charts. We're talking about calculations of universal time spans. Okay, chapter 3 describes that some calculations are inherently and entirely tropical. So then in text 9 through 11 of chapter 3, it explains that if you want to make these calculations relevant to Revati yogatara and the sidereal sphere, then you're going to have to understand the concept of precession of equinoxes. So the precession of equinoxes is a concept introduced here in the 9th, 10th, and 11th text of chapter 3. So that whole concept of precession and ayanamsha is introduced in chapter 3 of Sūrya Siddhānta for the sake of translating inherently tropical coordinates to sidereal coordinates, but not for the sake of creating a birth chart, for the sake of the context under discussion, which is understanding the current historical place in the cosmological timeline. Now you may say, no, that's not it at all. The 3rd chapter of Sūrya Siddhānta introduces ayanamsha so that we can create sidereal birth charts with a 12-fold zodiac. But A, you have to ignore the fact that that's not the context of chapter 3. B, you have to ignore the fact that the zodiac hasn't even been introduced yet in chapter 3 of Sūrya Siddhānta. And C, you have to ignore the fact that Sūrya Siddhānta just doesn't define a sidereal zodiac anywhere in the book. And in the 14th chapter, it does define a tropical zodiac.
Well, the Purāṇas and many other classical astronomical texts state that Asvini coincides with the beginning of Aries in one way or another. They say that. And this shows that they had a sidereal conception of the zodiac.
Okay, so the surviving classical Indian texts, they say two apparently contradictory things. So first they say the zodiac rests on the hub at the intersection of the diameters formed by the equinoxes and solstices. Right, so there's a circle, you got equinoxes and solstices, they make two diameters where they cross that intersection, that's the hub. And the zodiac rests on that hub. Aries, Cancer, Libra, and Capricorn begin at the 4 well-known points forming those diameters. So that's a literal quote from Sūrya Siddhānta, Pachakrana Bhau Vishruvat, Dvitiyam Samasutragam. Okay, so you get Purāṇas and Siddhāntas, they say that. They say, they define a tropical zodiac. But then the same books are going to say statements like, Aries commences with Aśvinī nakshatra. You can't get these two statements to be correct. Both of them can't be correct unless you get in a time machine and go back about 1800 years. So you have to decide what to do. you got a book that's supposed to be an authority on a subject, and it says two things, and one of them has to be false. Right? So what do? Do you pick one and erase the other one? So what you have to do is you have to figure out how both of these statements are correct.
They would have been correct if you could rewind time, right? Get in a time machine. So that's the solution. You have to make the veracity of one of the statements permanent and allow the veracity of the other statement to be time specific. So you got a statement like the zodiac rests on the hub at the intersection of the diameters formed by the equinoxes and solstices. So this statement is literally saying that the zodiac is anchored to the solstices and equinoxes, just in the same way as a wheel is anchored to a hub. So if you think about a wheel and a hub, the wheel turns when the hub turns, and the hub turns when the wheel turns. And the hub and the wheel don't change their relationship to each other. So that's the relationship that the Siddhantas and the Purāṇas describe between the zodiac and the equinoxes. It's like the relationship between a hub and a wheel. So it's literally saying this is permanent, this is a fixed, it doesn't change. The other statement is simply saying Aries begins with Aśvinī. So linguistically, the second statement is not defining the zodiac, and that's not even defining the nakshatras. The nakshatras are defined elsewhere in terms of their arc distance from a particular star. It's just a description of where the signs are in relation to the stars. And as I explained before, why do you give such a description? Because you got to make visual corrections to your calculations, so you need visual things correlated to the signs. So linguistics will help you resolve which statement is permanent and which statement is temporary. The affixation of the zodiac signs to the equinoxes and solstices is the permanent definition, and the observation of how those zodiac signs interact with the nakshatras is the contemporary observation. And in fact, as proof of this, or validation of this, the Vedas themselves don't evidence a permanent association of nakshatras to solstices or signs. Because the older texts, like Rig and Taittiriya Brahmana, for example, they don't take Aśvinī as the first nakshatra. They describe Krṛtikā as the first nakshatra. Logic will also help you resolve this dilemma. If you take the solstices and equinoxes as the permanent definers of the zodiac, then the elements and the modalities become logical. If you accept the nakshatras as the definers of the zodiac, there's no logic behind why certain signs have certain elements or modes. And there's other logics too that will help you arrive at the same conclusion. For example, if the zodiac is supposed to start at a particular star, why isn't there a star, noteworthy star, any kind of star on the ecliptic where it's supposed to start? Or why are there 12 equal-sized zodiac signs? It's not because there's 12 obvious clusters of stars, because those 12 clusters are, first of all, not obvious, and second of all, not 30 degrees. So these 12 zodiac signs are formed by the way the sun and the moon revolve around the earth, not by star clusters in the first place. So logic will also help you see that the signs are permanently affixed to the equinoxes and have a temporary relationship to the fixed stars.
Viṣṇu Purāṇa says that the physical universe is classified into three parts: bhu-loka, earth; bhu-bhuva-loka, which contains the planets; and swarga-loka, which contains the stars. The tropical zodiac has bhu-loka as its center and exists in bhu-bhuva-loka. The sidereal zodiac also has bhu-loka as its center, but it exists in swarga-loka.
Okay, yes, sure. Viṣṇu Purāṇa and other Puranas, they describe bhu-bhuva-sva. And so this differentiates the local space of the sun and planets from the deep space of the stars. Definitely, I agree. But what you're implying is that Viṣṇu Purāṇa defines a 12-fold sidereal zodiac and ascribes it to swarga-loka, which it doesn't. It's absolutely not true. These Puranas, they only define a tropical 12-fold zodiac. So what's out there in swarga-loka? Yes, it's a sidereal space, and that's where the gods live in their 27 nakshatra constellations.
Okay, look, you're trying to find out like which one is better, the tropical zodiac or the sidereal zodiac. You missed the point that both of them are used for different things, right? So the tropical and the sidereal zodiacs, they coexist, but they're used for different purposes. The tropical zodiac is meant for calculating things that are in reference to seasons, while the sidereal zodiac is meant for calculating things in reference to the stars. Therefore, we use the tropical zodiac for weather and calendars, and the sidereal zodiac for birth charts.
Okay, I agree that tropical and sidereal space coexist, but the sidereal space forms 27 nakshatras, and the tropical space forms 12 zodiac signs. Now, on to this bit about calendars, right? Yes, solstices are fundamental to the creation of the most popular types of calendars, but this doesn't mean that it's only used for calendars. In fact, the Vedas also use sidereal nakshatras to create calendars. So the idea that tropical stuff is just for calendrics and sidereal stuff is exclusively for divination doesn't stand up. And also this whole argument betrays a bit of ignorance about the way divination works. It shows a lack of awareness that the measurement of time, which is what calendars do, is absolutely essential for being able to tell the future, which is what divination does. So it's making this false dichotomy between telling time and making predictions.
When in fact, predictions and interpretations are nothing but a very elaborate way of describing time.
Now, as for the whole topic of the tropical zodiac being seasonal, the tropical zodiac is not a seasonal zodiac. And it's not based on seasons or anything like that. It's based on solstices and equinoxes. Now, seasons also are based on solstices and equinoxes. But this doesn't mean that the seasons are intrinsically related to zodiac signs. To put it in logical terms, A creates B, and A also creates C. That doesn't mean that C creates B or B creates C. So to explain what I'm talking about, my wife and I created my first son. That's like A creates B. And we also created our second son. That's like A creates C, right? So what's the relationship between B and C, the two kids? They're siblings. They're not parents to each other. So solstices, they create the zodiac. A creates B. And so solstices also create the seasons. A creates C. But that doesn't mean that the zodiac creates the seasons or the seasons create the zodiac. So why does the solstices create the zodiac and the seasons? Okay, this is why. The solstices create the zodiac because they create north, south, east, west correspondence in local space. And that north, south, east, west correspondence causes the elements associated with those cardinal directions to accumulate at their respective cardinal points and thus in their respective cardinal signs. It also allows the sun to differentiate high from low and take the domicile in the highest fiery zone. And it also causes the sun to have fixed cardinal and dual movement patterns as it approaches and moves away from the various cardinal points. And it's those three factors, the modalities, the elements, and the rulerships, which in turn create the symbolism of the various zodiac zones. So this is how the solstices create the zodiac. Now, solstices also create the weather because solstices are defining the angle that the sun has to the equator. And it's that angle between the sun and a point on Earth that causes the weather to change cyclically over the course of a year. So solstices create the zodiac and solstices create the seasons. So therefore, the seasons and the zodiac are siblings to each other, but they're not parents of each other.
All right, if it's true that in Jyotisha, the zodiac signs should be calculated tropically, but the nakshatras should be separately calculated sidereally. If that's true, why are you the only one, a Westerner, who's not even Indian? How come you're the one who gets it right and you're the only one who knows it?
So I'm not the only one who does it this way. There's many contemporary astrologers in and outside of India who use the same system I do or something very similar. In fact, we had a mention of Hora Ratnam earlier. So Hora Ratnam mentions that some people were using tropical signs in 17th century India. Vasishtha Samhita from 13th century also implies the same, otherwise it wouldn't have a need to mention tropical calculations. Raha Mihira in the 6th century mentioned that people had been switching away from tropical calculations. And then you have your 4th century and earlier texts which seem to indicate that tropical calculations were the norm at that time. So I'm not the only one. There's always been people doing it this way. In fact, the further back you go, the more common it would have been. In fact, I'm sure you're going to be quite surprised to learn this bit, that even the very committee that recommended Lahiri Siddhānta Ainamsha as the Indian standard in the late 1950s, that very committee expressly stated that the Siddhānta Ainamsha was just a partial reform, but that a full reform would be too disturbing to the public, and that it would require further reforms to return the zodiac to proper alignment with the solstices. So I'm hardly the only one, and it's hardly like it's only non-Indians who think this way.
So if you're right about all this, what about all those sidereal astrologers, Indian astrologers, Vedic astrologers? They're wrong?
No, it's not as simple as that. For thousands of years, astrologers have been giving good and bad readings using both sidereal and tropical zodiacs. So this is because a lot more goes into being right or wrong in your predictions or giving a good or bad reading than just the way you define the zodiac. If the tropical zodiac is right, it doesn't mean that the sidereal readings are wrong. It just means that the sidereal zodiac is wrong. But you may have developed a system and adjusted things to make that system work well.
So what actually changes in the charts if we use your system?
The nakshatras don't change, and therefore the dasha schedules based on them don't change. The transits and aspects of the planets to each other and to the house cusps is also unchanged. The signs that are occupied by the planet and the ascendant often change because we have a difference of about 24 degrees. And so the whole sign house system that these planets occupy often changes as well.
So what about all these Jyotish classics like Brighu Samhita, Parashara Hora? Are those supposed to be used with tropical signs?
Yes. So when those classics were written, there was very little difference between the sidereal and tropical zodiacs. So even if they were using a sidereal zodiac, it would have been almost identical to the tropical one. So the things they were referring to at the time of they were observing them would have been the same in tropical and sidereal.
I don't get it. There's so much debate going back and forth about tropical or sidereal. Don't the classic texts just say which one you should use?
Yes, they do, but people don't really want to hear it because it contradicts the custom and tradition that has arisen since then. But the truly classical texts from approximately 2,000 years ago, they say explicitly to use a tropical zodiac or to calculate a tropical zodiac, implying that you use what you calculate.
So you're saying to make the signs tropical but keep the nakshatras sidereal, but that splits up the nakshatras from the signs. So now you're going to have Asvini someplace else, and you're going to have Maghā someplace else. Well, how can that be? How can Asvini be someplace except the beginning of Aries?
This only blows your mind because you're used to thinking of nakshatras the way you're used to thinking of them. You've been taught that nakshatras are what they are because they're a combination of a certain sign with certain navamsha padas and certain vimshottari dasha planets. That's how the nakshatras have been explained. But this way of explaining nakshatras is not the indigenous, inherent, original way of understanding Vedic nakshatras. Originally, we understood the nakshatras by the gods and the goddesses who dwelt in them. How can Asvini not be in the beginning of Aries? I mean, the beginning of Aries was in Krṛtikā in the Rig Veda and Yajur Veda. So, I don't know, somehow it must be able to not be in the beginning of Aries.
How do you explain the 12 symbols of the zodiac? Most people say they were taken from Egyptian sidereal constellations.
So the zodiac is made of a combination of planetary rulers, elements, and modes. Then the unique combination of these three in each one of the 12 sections creates some symbolic implications unique to each section. Astrologers then gave those symbolic implications a keyword or a face by using a name and an image of an animal or a type of person. That's how you get symbols. You know, Virgo is Virgo because it's Mercury with Earth, so it's a thoughtful but slow-paced, detailed-oriented person. So in those days, they ascribed that to young women, cautious, detail-oriented. Then when they referenced the signs to the stars for the sake of checking their math, they projected those images into the stars. And that's why you get constellations that are supposed to represent those shapes. Now you might say, no, in Egypt they looked up at the stars and they saw the shape of a girl up there, and that's why they ascribe certain symbolism to it. I don't find that very compelling. You know, I find my explanation a lot more compelling than the idea that 4 dots in the sky looks like a crab.
If what you're saying is right, then why don't you prove it? why don't you do chart reading comparisons and demonstrate that the tropical zodiac is more accurate than the sidereal zodiac?
You see, I really don't think this is necessary. I don't see why this is even necessary. We already have tons of evidence, right? We have thousands of astrologers for centuries working on thousands of charts, producing right and wrong predictions, good and bad readings, using both systems. So why do you need 4 more cross-analysis of charts from me? 4 more after you have hundreds of thousands that show that either system can be bad or good, and that it's way more complicated than just the definition of a zodiac. Analyzing a chart is way more complex than just the way you define your zodiac. But I know that you really want this really bad, and I know that, and I'm also sick of hearing you guys say that this proves that I'm weak and my theories are weak, that I won't compare charts. So the next major video that I'm going to do, I'll compare sidereal and tropical charts of Trump, Einstein, Tesla, and Hitler.
Okay, if zodiac signs are tropical, then how do you calculate astrological ages?
Well, in the Indian tradition, as I mentioned when I was talking about chapter 3 of Sūrya Siddhānta, we do it by observing planetary conjunctions in relation with specific fixed stars. In the current Western tradition, you do it by comparing the actual equinoctial point with its sidereal reference.
Okay, when somebody says Vedic, like Vedic astrology, everybody automatically assumes that the chart's going to be sidereal. So if Vedic astrology can be done tropically, then what the heck does Vedic astrology even mean?
Okay, the word Vedic means that it's related to or comes from the Vedas. So actually, very little of any astrology today is truly Vedic by this definition. And honestly, the term is pretty impossible to strictly apply because the Vedas and Purāṇas themselves very rarely, if ever, discuss how to do horoscopic astrology. So it's a very loose term, Vedic astrology. A division between Vedic astrology and Western astrology is definitely falsely exaggerated to the extreme. And probably the divide between using tropical and sidereal into 2 groups is what allows that exaggeration to take root and flourish. But the more you rewind Western astrology in time to its Hellenistic roots, the more identical it and Vedic astrology become. Practically, what Vedic astrology means is this is classical astrology that's been preserved very well over the centuries and wasn't disturbed by cultural upheavals and translations through different cultures as it was in the West.
So what do you think this whole tropical sidereal debate actually reveals about ourselves as astrologers and as human beings? And how can we use that information to improve the astrological community?
So what I personally learned from it is I need to be a lot more polite, or try to be more polite whenever possible. Also, I shouldn't expect too much from people. Like I shouldn't expect that they're going to understand me the first 500 times I say it. Now, how the astrological community could improve, I think people could care a little bit less about who they are. I think that gets in the way of a lot of things. You need to care less about who's who and more about what's what.
So I heard that tropical and sidereal astrology was aligned. The signs and the degrees were exactly the same 2,000 years ago. What's your take on this?
Okay, about 2,000 years ago is when astrologers began using the 12 signs extensively to visually confirm their calculations of what planets were in what signs. They had to correlate the signs to the visible stars. So they did that 2,000 years ago. Now, over time, you have a phenomenon called precession of equinoxes, which makes that relationship between the stars and the signs change. It gets bigger and bigger and bigger over time, and currently it's about 24 degrees different from what it was 2,000 years ago. But somebody can say that 2,000 years ago, the sidereal and tropical zodiacs were exactly the same because it's 2,000 years ago when they made the reference between signs and stars.
What's the difference between the way you and Ernst Wilhelm calculate the nakshatras?
Well, Ernst projects the coordinates to the equator, while most everybody else projects them to the ecliptic. And I don't know why he does it that way, because the planets don't travel around the equator, they travel around the ecliptic. So what I want to know is nakshatra coordinates relative to the ecliptic. So I stick with Lahiri Ainamsa, basic Ainamsa, calculated in a normal way on the ecliptic, whereas he goes into other Ainamsas and he calculates them to the equator for some reason or another.
So tell me once and for all, are there 27 nakshatras or 28?
So there's 27 nakshatras, but the 28th is Abhijit, and that is Vega. It's a polar star. So the 28th nakshatra is a reference to what is called Dhruva, the Dhruva point, which is the north celestial pole, which is like the umbrella shaft that the 27 nakshatras are like the umbrella spokes on. So it's not one of the 27 ecliptical nakshatras, but it's their pivot point. That's the 28th one, Abhijit. Sometimes we will take a equinoctial equivalent of Abhijit, in which case we basically figure it as being the fourth quarter of Uttarashada. And there are some alternative, unconventional ways of calculating unequal nakshatras with 28 divisions that are rarely used. But actually what the nakshatras are 27, and if you look in the ancient books, there's 27. But the 28th is also named, and it's like the pivot point for the other 27.
Okay, you say the nakshatras are stars and constellations, so obviously they're sidereal. What if that's the truth? Why are they all equally 13 degrees and 20 minutes? The constellations are not equal sizes. The stars are not even any size.
Nakshatras are not stars. Tara are stars. But nakshatra are based on Tara. So nakshatra are fields, and the 12 signs are also fields. But the 12 signs are fields based on the equinoxes, and the nakshatras are fields based on specific stars, yogataras. The signs are 30 degrees because the sun moves that much when the moon goes around once. The nakshatras are 13 and a third degree because the moon moves that much when the sun goes around once.
Why did the ancient Vedic astrologers consider Krṛtikā, not Asvini, to be the first nakshatra?
Perhaps it's because when they conceived of this whole system, the equinoctial point was in Krṛtikā. And that would mean that they conceived of this whole system about 5,000 years ago. Or perhaps it's because Krṛtikā is the abode of Agni. And Agni is always the first god invoked in any Vedic function. The name Agni literally means first goer. And the name Krṛtikā literally means the initiator.